When we talk about climate finance, there is an important issue that we have to look at, and that is the responsibility that developed countries have to developing countries. 200 years of carbon gas emissions are what is creating the problem we have at the moment, and those emissions are from developed countries. What the Paris Agreement says is that those developed countries have an obligation to assist developing countries in achieving their climate ambition.
Sometimes when I hear leaders, government leaders from the developed world talk, they speak as if the problem is Africa. The real problem is not here in Africa. We're not, as a continent, a big unit. And at the same time, because we're an energy short continent, everybody's looking towards a low emissions future. And the new generation capacity that comes on will largely be low emissions.
We want a climate resilient society, so we want people, communities, people in rural areas, young people and women, to be able to have the capacity to withstand a physically changing climate and all of the impacts around water and food and heat and disasters that it's going to create.
I'm quite satisfied that South Africa is well positioned to do the right thing as we go into the future. If you ask people, just an ordinary person in the street, he'll say that the blackouts must stop. We need energy security. Really the big focus that we have.
We need to take some very big policy decisions around how we procure electricity. This is a complex issue that involves all spheres of government.
We need to build and construct more generation capacity. That gives us the wonderful opportunity to do things in a green way and to ensure that any new capacity that comes onto stream is renewable. Because it means that instead of destroying jobs, you're creating jobs. You're improving livelihoods for people. You're creating opportunities for entrepreneurs and for business and such things.
In a sense, the sort of anchor project of the Just Transition is the first coal-fired power station that's being decommissioned. There are detailed plans on the table now to repurpose the power station, set up a renewable energy generation plant at Komati, and link that to a skills academy, which is being built with the renewable energy industry. I do need to say there's not one worker at Eskom that's going to lose their job as Komati is decommissioned.
We know in South Africa we are endowed with amazing renewable energy resources, and so the opportunity is there for us to really become a leader in this field, to try to really escalate and generate a kind of sense of renewal in our economy around a huge renewable energy build. So that's a really important thing that has to happen. We see real signs of climate change in our country already. We also see extended droughts, but we've also had some really devastating and fatal floods in our country. All of these things are really starting to affect the kind of economic well-being and people's lived experience in South Africa. So these are also all some of the reasons why we have to move, and we have to move from fossil fuels to cleaner forms of energy.
So as we have an ambitious NDC, we must have an ambitious just transition process, and the two have to work hand in hand. And I think we were unique when it comes to our country and South Africa's position, because you had an NDC that had the language of a just transition embedded in it, which I think for me is quite progressive. A carbon neutral sort of future for me looks like, first of all, us having more equality. a transition is disruptive in nature, but we should be able to distribute the effects of this disruption equally across all parties. We can't have a situation where the business sector gains and then communities and workers are left behind. So for me, in order for us to achieve carbon neutrality, we need to look at how do we achieve this in a balanced manner and how do we do this in a manner that is equal, because what you would hate is for us to have a carbon neutral future and you've worsened the current socioeconomic issues for our country.
In South Africa, we have about 10,000 people a year who die prematurely as a result of air pollution from coal mining and coal power generation. And that doesn't take into account the many, many people who are ill, who are admitted to hospital, who are missing school days, who are missing work days and missing out on opportunities as a result of this polluted air that they're breathing. Increasingly every year we have more evidence about how coal pollution and air pollution generally is affecting people's health and their well-being. And so this cannot go on as it has always gone on. We have to stop, we have to move away from this and look after people's health and well-being.
The Climate Commission is a multi-stakeholder body. We are made up of business organizations, all the big business companies in South Africa, labor organizations, organized labor, the different federations and trade unions, civil society, NGOs, activists, young people, science organizations, and of course government.
When the President appointed the Commission, he gave them the task of putting together societal consensus on what a just transition would look like, and also supporting the work that government and the private sector are doing to identify transition pathways for vulnerable sectors of the economy.
Its main purpose is to build a national agreement on the pathway from a high emissions economy, where we are now, to the desired low emissions economy, and to ensure that we do it in a manner which everybody agrees so that it can move fast. It's not just government policy, it's a societal agreement. And that's the best thing you can have to lay the basis for a positive future.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome back to those of you that have joined this session. Louise, I'm talking to you as well. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask a big favor? Seeing that this is not a very popular group, we thought it would be the biggest one, hence the reason why we've arranged the large venue. But could I possibly ask, just in terms of process, just for everybody to move forward so we can have it, very interactive and very informal, if you don't mind. Thank you. Yes. I unfortunately do not have that authority tool here with me. You know that's what they call the authority tool, no? Okay. Ladies and gents, can we move a little bit forward? Let's move to the front here, please. Because ideally we would like to manage this process without microphones and stuff, seeing that we're not a very large group. Don't be shy, Ntate. There's some nice chairs right here in front. Ne? Yeah, but then we're going on lunch, and then after lunch we're coming back, so you can go back to your seat during lunch, after lunch. Don't be afraid, Ntate. You heard our young lion says we don't need to be afraid. Ne? All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to be running out of time, so we're going to start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jacques Higu. I'm a commissioner within the PCC, representing organized labor. And allow me just to welcome each and every one of you to this working group this afternoon. Can I ask those gentlemen and ladies that are at the back, if you kindly would join us here in front? We thought this would be the biggest group, hence the big venue, but let's make it cozy here in front. To fellow commissioners, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed of those people that are attending. Louise, we don't know. You know, there might be a minister sitting here that I'm not seeing. There's a light in my eye. So, ladies and gentlemen, this group is about the electricity planning and grid expansion, and the objective of this discussion is to come up with recommendations that will flow into our recommendations as a PCC to the State President. So, without any further ado, allow me to just welcome to the front one of the fellow commissioners, Brian. If you could join us in front, please. Brian is just going to take us through, ladies and gentlemen, a brief background in terms of electricity planning and grid expansion. Brian, I don't know if someone want to come and stand here.
Yeah. It's afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues. As Jack has said, my name is Brian Mantlana. I am at the CSIR. I lead the climate change team at the CSIR. I'm speaking here as one of the commissioners today. My task is fairly simple, and I'm going to help Jack with time management. It is to provide a brief technical input as a way of introducing the subject matter. So, Jack, I'm planning to speak for a maximum of 10 minutes. And only 3 points that I want to address. Firstly, I think it's just important to say that I want to thank the Secretariat for the work they've done to get the document which is containing these recommendations that we are considering to the state that it is at. That's a lot of work that has gone in there. So to just talk about, to introduce this session briefly, perhaps I thought let's remind ourselves what is the challenge that we are trying to address. And I've got 4 points under that question. In South Africa, we like focusing on challenges, so I thought let me join that bandwagon of starting with challenges. The first one is that we're in the middle of climate crisis. And this is not a South African crisis, it's a global crisis. And globally, we all will have to decarbonize our electricity systems. And I'm choosing words here carefully. Not we must, we have to decarbonize our electricity systems. And that decarbonization is essential for development, it's essential for economy. And I think I want to remind ourselves that the decarbonization process is not only about the energy sector. We normally talk about the energy sector, but it manifests in many sectors beyond the energy sector. So I just want to remind ourselves that we spend a lot of time talking about electricity planning and energy planning, but I want to remind us that it goes beyond that sector. The second crisis is we are in the middle of energy transitions globally. I'm putting it as a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And as South Africa, we cannot stop that transition. It's happening globally. It's not happening in the future, it's happening now, that transition. And the extent to which we participate is going to locate or position our economy versus other economies of the world. Third challenge is that we are in an energy crisis as a country. We have a fleet of old coal power plants which are becoming less and less reliable. You don't need a reminder about that. We have a backlog in investment in transmissions and distribution. As the economy is growing, the supply is not meeting that growth. So electricity planning needs to address both the short-term energy crisis that we are currently experiencing and the longer-term investments in generation, transmission, and distribution to ensure that we have energy security for the country. Lastly, my fourth point under the first part I want to share, Jacques, is that as a country we've got other goals beyond the energy transition that we need to talk about, to keep in mind. In South Africa, we've got an air pollution challenge. It is a real challenge that we are facing. We've got real socio-economic challenges that we need to keep in mind as we talk about this transition. There's an issue of ensuring our planning, when we talk about electricity planning, that it's sufficiently responsive to the rapid changes that are happening in the economic side and also in the electrical technical systems. So whatever we're talking about, we need to realize that it's a moving boat that we are dealing with here. It's not a static system. The second point I want to talk about is on electricity planning. Just touching on what needs to be considered when you're talking about electricity planning. And in South Africa, you cannot talk about electricity planning without making a reference to the IRP. The IRP is a powerful tool, it's a powerful decision-making tool in the electricity sector. And personally, I welcome the thinking, the process of updating the IRP. But there's an issue of transparency in updating that IRP. And that issue of transparency is important for procedural justice reasons. And more importantly is to ensure that the technical expertise that we have in South Africa is optimally used as we update the IRP. So the issue of transparency is important. Secondly is that the IRP as it being updated is not happening in isolation also. Since 2019, when we last updated it, we've revised our NDC as a country. We've produced a just transition framework. We've got a JET IP. Other departments have also done other relevant works, like the DTIC. It's got proposed industrialization around green hydrogen, electric vehicles, and electricity supply components. So I'm mentioning this to this audience, perhaps it's obvious, but it's important as a context to know that the IRP needs to take into account a broader set of issues than just the energy sector, but the ecosystem around it has evolved since that time. The third last point, Jacques, that I want to share is the updating of the IRP to 2050 will require a massive investment in generation, transmission, and distribution. We all know that we are behind already in doing all of these things. As you know, our current grid is designed to take power mainly from Mpumalanga to the rest of the country. And that needs to change. That approach needs to change going to the future. A future grid, which we need to invest to now, will be far more complex than what we have currently. It will need to transport electricity from areas of the country where it can most economically be generated. The Northern Cape, the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, to where the demand is. So there are short-term challenges and there are long-term challenges. The short-term challenge is to prioritize grid investment as a matter of urgency. The long-term challenge is to understand and implement the grid of the future. And perhaps this morning or this afternoon we'll talk about that. So in conclusion, Jacques, I just want to talk about something that I thought was a little bit missing in the document, or maybe I missed it, I hope, is that there's a discussion that's taking place in the African Union about the continent-wide regional grid interconnection. There's a conversation in the AU about the continental-wide regional grid interconnection. So our transmission planning should consider our place as South Africa in the Southern African power pool and the broader regional integration. And lastly, the grid and the system operator will be at the core of the electricity system to come. There are innovative options for private financing of grid infrastructure, which are worth exploring, but a reformed state utility with the transmission grid at its heart will continue to play a catalytic role in the economy, as it is appropriate for a country like ours, which is a developmental state. To get there, we need all the help that we can get locally. We need all the help from our international partners, and we need that help urgently. From our side, as South Africans, we need to avoid making short-term decisions as we respond to this current energy crisis. Thank you.
Brian, thank you for setting the scene. Ladies and gentlemen, how we're going to, what I would propose, how we handle the session, is that I now take hands if there are any clarity-seeking questions or comments. Ladies and gentlemen, what is important for us today is to walk away as this group with a number of recommendations that would assist us in terms of formulating the response to the state president. So I'm going to open up the floor, and I'm going to take a few questions. Myself and Brian are going to attempt to answer the questions as best possible, but I'm going to be heavily reliant on Steve. That's more of a technical expert than ourselves. Do I see any hands? Sir, I recognize your hand. You're number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you all got microphones in front of you. If you can just switch them on. There you are. You just flip it up. And then there's a button. Yeah. That's it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Thabo Manana. I am the Chief Technical Officer for Seagen Solar. And the question that I have is, has Eskom considered placing solar panels on so many roofs, meaning diversifying away from coal and the diesel-fired generators in order to sort of supplement these coals, right? Which means that it would meet this 2030 deadline with the Paris Accord, but also diversify, right? In the sense that Eskom would be still the utility to place inverters, solar panels on top of roofs, let's say in Soweto and areas like that where there are plenty of empty roofs, and charge a fee, same fee that they've been charging for the use of electricity, meaning that no cost to the consumers, but still do that, basically diversifying away from coal and diesel. Thank you.
Thank you. Number 2, I think you were here. My apology for referring to you as numbers.
No problem. My name is Thabang Odet. I'm from Department of Mineral Resources and Energy.
So you will have to speak up a little bit.
Yeah, my name is Thabang Odet. I'm from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. So just one question from my side. There is a recommendation on the future mix, I think they indicated 50 gigawatts to 60 gigawatts of solar PV, plus some battery storage, plus some gas, which is at a very low capacity factor. So a simple question from me is, has this recommendation been tested, whether realistically as a country we are able to implement such? I'm asking that because we all know variable renewable energy cannot sustain our industry. So has this been tested before we make a recommendation to the state president? Thanks.
So is that as an input into the new IRP?
No, there's a recommendation when you go through a document.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that 50 gigawatts to 60 gigawatts. And there's a suggestion that it must be considered in the IRP review.
Okay.
But my question is, has that been tested, whether practically it's possible for us to commit to such high numbers?
Okay. Thank you. I think number 3 was here.
Thanks, and good afternoon. And my name is Kadri Nesip. I'm from the city of Cape Town. And it's more a comment, actually, but something to reflect on, I think, as we look at the IRP and its significance. Certainly when one looks at the changing landscape, and particularly the way that regulations pertaining to generation have been amended, etc., and the increased role that the private sector will play, and also the municipalities, it should perhaps be noted that somewhere that in the preparation of new IRPs going forward, in the methodology that's employed, that we now start looking more and more at basing it on a bottom-up approach in which we consider as a baseline what the municipalities and the private sector are doing in that space. For example, small-scale embedded generation in the city of Cape Town has reached more than 80 megawatts of installed capacity, which is just from private homeowners as well as from commercial businesses. So from that perspective, that quantum is growing, it's significant. What the municipalities are doing is highly significant. And then we must look at the approach of filling in the gaps using a national resource bid via ESCOM or any other state entity. I think what we also must not neglect is the integrated energy plan that also is desperately in need of some revision. We have to consider, notwithstanding the fact that we have a load shedding crisis, that there is also a fuel crisis looming. At the end of the day, from a climate change perspective, we also need to consider our mitigation measures in that regard. So certainly the IEP itself must be reworked, and then that links back to the old energy policy of '98, which is obviously also on the table, and maybe Tabang at some stage can comment on that. But in reality, we now need to look at where is the next wave of innovation coming from. Where are we with green hydrogen or with ammonia or any other future technology, even small, if we go back to modular nuclear reactors, for example, is that going to be in our electricity future, for example? So all of that needs to be considered if we are able to move forward, both in the short term and in the longer term. Thanks.
Thank you. Number 4. There you are.
Maybe just to capture what has been mentioned just before, but I think it's pertinent, Hendrik Low, Northern Cape, then specifically driving aggressively the Northern Cape Green Hydrogen Strategy, the Western SADC Green Hydrogen Strategy, and then the master plan. For me, it's just the imbalance that we're currently experiencing in the South African context, and we just returned from a successful delegation to Germany, and I mean, it's typically a benchmark that we can reference. Our grid is not speaking to our industry and our consumption patterns, and therefore the Western SADC corridor becomes pertinent. As an intermediate, I do foresee that there's certain efficiencies, and I know there's initiatives underway currently to optimize via curtailing ETC. Our grid can accept more, but it's just not optimally managed. So I think for interim phase, let's optimally manage our grid. And grid management and curtailing is something pertinent, and this is where groups like a 50 Hertz ETC comes in quite referenced to assist. In addition, though, is we need to give to our local and foreign investor niche the commitment on grid that we will be able to access. I think the drive towards incentivizing green product, green industry, incentivizing sounds beautiful, but on the other side, there's the penalty element. And we're going to be starting to incur that penalty element. And if we look at economies, especially our rural economies, the IRP must make provision for that already. That we're going to lay bare our agricultural export, we the fruit basket for the winter months of Europe. Our mining sector, our steel will not have that audience which it's currently having, and the demand is already for green. Mercedes-Benz, whom we met with as well. these likes are out there. So I think the RFP must really look at that energy balance, and we will also see a shift of energy. Germany has already seen that shift of industry moving towards the energy shift. But we must balance to, I want to say, not cannibalize. And the IRP must address it. It must give that surety of energy supply and that surety of green energy supply. Because our industry will be standing at doors with nobody willing to take it up at their prices. Pertinent for me, though, is, as reference, is we need to adapt our RP to speak the lingo of not just any more grid, but also pipeline, because it doesn't stop with the green electron. The green electron cannot effectively address mobility, industry feedstock. And this is where green hydrogen solutions and the related ammonia, PTX is coming to play. And we will have to write that in. Our backbone infrastructure is also at this stage very fossil dependent, very north-south towards the east coast of South Africa dependent. We need to break in, because Gauteng has got a lovely green hydrogen strategy. Please do tell me where they're going to get that tonnage. We've got Secunda. We know what Secundas need. We cannot. I mean, it was blatantly mentioned on certain international platforms that we will have to sacrifice Secunda. South Africa cannot afford to sacrifice Secunda. So that's the surety that our RP must give, that will continue. But in that surety, that we will give that required green energy and infrastructure, that we will still have certified green product, because our economy can either grow from this or we can be knocked down, face down. That's the reality. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting comments. It's that most important signals of value to the international world to be able to attract. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to the next few questions, I'm not even going to try and attempt to answer those technical questions, and I'm going to ask Steve to assist in terms of some of the comments that were made and some of the questions that were asked. Steve, if I may ask you, please.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everyone. I can't speak for Eskom, and I see that Vikesh is here, so he might be better placed to answer the specific question to Eskom. But I think the point that is being raised there is that there's a systemic issue, and you pick it up as well, is that there are things happening in all parts of the grid, from the bottom-up distribution level to rooftop solar, that have implications for how we run the system, how we price electricity, the regulations for electricity that need to be part of the way we think about electricity planning going forward. And the key recommendation that's emerging from all of our stakeholder engagements is that we need to start thinking about electricity planning spatially. What's happening locally? Where are the grid connections available? Especially in the short term, because that's the quickest way for us to get power onto the grid. But also in the long term. And Brian raised some of these points already. To Bang's question, the way that we arrived at this recommendation on an electricity mix was to review several local and international studies that are looking at what is the least cost stable electricity system, and all of them conclude similar things, similar volumes of renewable energy, similar volumes of battery storage, and peaking support. Predominant fuel for peaking support at this stage is gas. So that's kind of what we are anchoring on as a least cost energy pathway. So Bang's question is about security. Can you do that and provide stable supply to industry? And again, the theory is yes, but we are also seeing that in practice. So we are seeing countries around the world investing heavily in renewables and decreasing their investment in coal. And we're seeing renewable electricity penetrations already today of between 50 and 60%. And the concerns that engineers and people who are running the power plants have about the variability of power plants are manageable. Definitely up to that point. That's a proven test case. And so in the short term, taking the precautionary principle, we would invest in renewables now and start to invest around what are the challenges in that post 60% implementation. And again, the technologies that we need to provide stable electricity power using variable renewable energy exist today. They're mature existing technologies. And so these are very solvable problems, and this has been confirmed over and over by the studies that we've reviewed and the experts that we've spoken to. So we've tested it as much as it can be. Obviously, this is something that is relatively new globally, so no one's really pushed past to 80% penetration, although there have been instances of short-term instantaneous penetration of those kinds of levels without any major problems. So I think the important thing is, yes, we believe that these renewable energy systems are stable. We have to learn from our counterparts that have been implementing these systems and learning the lessons in real time. But this is something that we should be focused on.
Thank you. And with regards to the changes in the IRP, noted, absolutely. It's important for the IRP to speak to our future needs. And I think one of the comments that were made in the plenary earlier on was that a plan cannot be put on the table and have a longevity of 30 years. Nowadays, 5 years is even too long. So point absolutely taken. Steve?
Just to point out that Tabang is probably the best person to respond on IRP, given that it is his unfortunate job to manage that process. And then also, it would be cool to hear from Vikesh from an Eskom perspective.
Okay. Tabang, would you mind to comment?
Yeah, the process to review the IRP has started. IRP has always been a long-term plan. The current one is up to 2030, right? And we are revising now to do up to 2050. So there's never been a shorter term than 10 years IRP. Yeah. But obviously, you know, I want to get to this point of solar PV and or wind being the recommendations of PCC, electricity planning. And I'm hearing that it's based on international literature and experiences elsewhere in the world. You know, unfortunately, the system, the South African electricity system, does not operate based on some international literature. At the end, should we adopt this, we would see all these plants connecting to the grid, right? Because it's not only theory. There will be projects, there will be connection to the grid. Now, if we don't assess what that impact will have on our national grid, I think we are not doing a complete job. The current IRP review, we're going to develop an energy mix, and it's not only PV and wind, it goes beyond that. I think the overall approach is that we're looking for technologies that are not emitting high carbons, right? And those goes beyond PV and wind. The second test that we must do, and perhaps PCC must also consider doing, is look at the transmission, Eskom transmission system. 50 gigawatts of PV, is that realistic? Is there something that can connect to that transmission grid? The third issue, assuming we connect 50 gigawatts, the system operator, so the people that are, you know, have the responsibilities of balancing supply, demand on an hourly basis, will they be able to control a system with 5 gigawatts of coal up and down? If you add 50 gigawatts of VRE on that, is that system operable? Is there anyone else in the world that has, let's say, 30% of base load and VRE of the balance, 70%? I hear the story about batteries, using batteries and gas to try and create, you know, a level PV and wind. But my point is that we need to test that solution. Right? Eskom transmission is here. I'm not sure if system operations is here. We need to engage Eskom transmission. We need to engage Eskom system operator with these recommendations. Because you recommend something that, fine, it goes through cabinet, it gets approved, but it's not implementable because of the technical constraints that we have not tested prior to finalizing the recommendation. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Thanks.
Taken. Kugesh?
Good morning all. I'm Vikesh Rajpal from Eskom's Just Energy Transition Office. The question asked was, has Eskom explored rooftop PV? And the simple answer is yes, we have. It comes down to a question of should we allow the market to do what the market does best, and we find it difficult to have a business case for a large organization like Eskom to embark on something like that where there is significant amount of competition. So we are continuously trying to, we are exploring options in terms of having a positive business case, and when we do, we will be looking at branching out into rooftop PV. But for now, it's still conceptual.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I'd just like to answer to Tabang and the gentleman. I'm talking from the private sector, and I'm just going to just rattle off some numbers. From, say, 2021 to now, the industry has grown in the upwards of about 600%. Okay, when we talk numbers in terms of sales, I'll quote somewhere from going from maybe 750 million rands a year to about 2.7 billion a year in a very short space of time. So the private sector has really exploded in terms of getting backup storage, solar panels. At this point, as I'm speaking to you, there is a shortage of solar panels coming in. As a distributor, we are able to bring in something like 30 to 50 megawatts that we're distributing through SADC and the rest of Africa, are bringing it in, right? So the private sector has responded in an incredible way in terms of where we are running out of stock. We cannot keep up as the private sector to try to fulfill this. So the question was, if we in the private sector, and I understand the competition question, which is a very, very valid point, if we're doing this now, where is the response of reacting to a grid that's near collapse, right? We all know that, and we know when that happens, it's all bets are off, right? We all know we are teetering at the edge of going below that threshold, right? We flirt with it, but once we go down below that threshold, everybody knows the entire country's power system goes down. There is no power for anybody, okay? That is a disaster, and we're teetering on it, and I'm just wondering why the response hasn't been as this is a national emergency type situation.
Okay. Louise, before I get to you, Kagesh, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. As I've indicated, rooftop PV, the original question was, has Eskom explored rooftop PV? I've given an answer to that in terms of we haven't found a suitable niche for Eskom in terms of that competitive space. In terms of large-scale generation from PV and wind, we have explored options. We have a number of projects that we have developed, but bear in mind that Eskom is in a cash-constrained, or Eskom has a significantly cash-constrained balance sheet. It's a weak balance sheet. We have difficulty in accessing additional funding. The Minister of Finance has recently made as part of the debt relief package, imposed significant constraints in terms of Eskom's investment in new generation capacity. So while we have projects in place that we have developed, and in many cases they are ready for execution, we simply haven't been able to take that next step in terms of the investment because of the cash flow constraint that we have. We are part of a number of initiatives in terms of NECOM and NatJoints and other national initiatives in terms of how can we address the energy crisis as such. We are exploring options in terms of as I mentioned, NECOM, but improved maintenance, improved efficiencies, increasing the energy availability factor of our power stations. It's a key focus area in Eskom given the cash constraints. It does not allow for a sustainable organization in terms of Eskom of the future not being able to invest at this stage. Where does it leave us in terms of a sustainable organization? And there is, we believe, a place in the economy for a sustainable Eskom, well, Eskom as a whole, all three unbundled divisions as such. plays a significant role in the economy, and we do need to have plans in place that we not just shut down those power stations, but also have additional capacity that comes online to feed or to support the country as such. In addition to that, we have a 2035 shutdown plan that's based on shutting down the power stations as they reach end of economic life or as they reach end of technical life. We are not pushing, as part of our strategy, for a premature shutdown of any of our power stations, except the one, which is Tutuka, and there are specific reasons for that. In the short term, as part of the energy support or the support of the energy crisis, we are looking at reviewing that and continuing operation of those power stations that are scheduled to be shut down, including those that have already, according to the IRP, should have been shut down. So we've continued operation of some of those to assist the system in meeting, to some extent, the demand. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Kugesh. Shall we go to the second round of hands? Louise, I have noted your hand. Number 2. Number 3 and number 4. Let's go for number 5 here. Steve, number 6. Right. Number 7. Okay. All right. The list is getting longer. All right, Louise.
Thank you. So I just want to assure people that the Commission, in both its recommendations on, we were asked to respond to the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that Mr. Minele's team developed before he resigned as the head of that team. And in our proposed electricity recommendations, we understand the grid constraints and are saying that a lot of money and a lot of attention needs to go to that. So, all the rest is based off that. So please, at least know that on that kind of technical basis, we have done the homework and we're very aware of grid constraints and therefore are making a strong recommendation in that regard. And then I want to talk about the difference between South Africa and these other countries where they have much greater penetration of renewable energy than us. The difference is we have by far the better resource. So I've been in this game for a very long time now, 15 years I think. And the story, the sort of emotional story that people say is, but we have God-given resources in the form of coal, and therefore we have a right to exploit them. Well, we have God-given best resources in the world of solar and wind. So can we please apply that same fervor, nationalistic fervor, to those resources as much? I think people can't, and I'm not saying it's people in this room, but a lot of other people can't wrap their head around the fact that something that's pouring at you free is actually a resource. But they are our resources, and let us make best use of them. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Louise, as always. Number 2. Yes, sir?
Number 2. So I just wanted to also... So the IRP simply speaks about electricity alone. I haven't heard people speak about the integrated energy plan, which was the previous speaker's point on why are we so much vested in speaking about the IRP, which focuses on electricity, whereas the IEP focuses on energy holistically. And this is one recommendation I think the PCC needs to bring forth. Why the IEP? It has taken since 2008 for this particular legislature to be in place. And I think for that piece of legislature not to be in place, we will not see energy supply, we will not see environmental sustainability, we will not see energy security, accessibility, nor affordability. because we are looking at it from a one side or one point of view. So what I'd like to propose is that whatever recommendations the PCC does articulate to the President himself is to also articulate that we need a plan. And the plan is the integrated energy plan. And that's the only plan that seeks to address most of the things that people are talking about here. And one other point to say or to speak is that if we can sympathize with coastal communities who have been speaking about oil and gas for several amounts of years, that which also needs to be put in the forefront when you speak about gas to power at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, where are we getting this gas? Back to the ocean, that which people sustain their livelihoods through. That we which also come back to want to have a conversation about employment, people's livelihoods, and how people live. So that's the one point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it adds to that notion of the just transition and a just energy transition, talking about leaving nobody behind. If I may just make a comment, Rifta Ajam from Fiducia made a very valuable comment this morning to say that we've got all of these plans, but are they talking to each other? And for us to reach energy surety and to reach that goal of net zero by 2050, all of these need to talk to each other. And you need to be able to, and I'm going to use your notion, remove those silos between those plans where these plans start talking to each other. Number 3, I think it was that side, sir?
Thank you. The name is Naftali Mukhalapa from DMRE. I just thought maybe I should come to the report a bit. But before I do that, let me just indicate that there was a point that was made that information is being sourced, by learning from other countries globally and so on. What we have been able to see in recent years is that when we talk about, or the global community talks about the just energy transition, there's an interest in looking at energy mix that is able to sustain whatever the grids that the grid that they have in their countries and so on. And what they normally talk about is towards the just energy transition, we should be looking at pathways that are basically leading us to climate neutrality, accommodating all these energy sources that can be able to get us there. And I'm saying this because if you look at what is happening, for instance, in Europe and to some extent in the US and so on, you find that they are considering other energy sources that they feel that can be able to fast-track the process of them reaching the just energy transition. But when I look at this report, I don't see that coming through strongly. And I will give an example, for instance, with nuclear, which we know for now, at the moment, is part of the the EU's taxonomy. But it's not something that we are looking at. And in the closing remarks of the minister, she indicated that firstly we have to learn, and also we have to plan long term, which means that all these elements that are meant to lead us to that neutrality should be considered. What I find in the report is that, which is an addition to what I've just indicated, because when you look at nuclear, there's a lot of opportunities that are coming in that space. Not only from a perspective of cost, which is something that is being talked about here, but that cost, I find that it is outdated cost. Because the current cost, if you look at the International Energy Agency, for instance, projection of electricity generation costs and so on, the costs are not near that cost of, what is it? It's 212,000. 212,000 per kilowatt hour. That cost, I think it needs to be looked at, and consequently also with the low cost of electricity, the levelized cost and so on, because they look outdated and they look extremely high. At some point, the department did a study with a request for information, for instance, where the costs that were coming through there were much lower than that. And I think maybe that might be an engagement that the PCC would need to do to get those inputs and certainly get the references that are generally considered to be reputable globally from the IEA, from the IEA, from the NEI, and so on. And these can be provided to if they're not accessible. But I think it's something that needs to be considered. But I think maybe talk to me about this issue of the taxonomy of the country. Why is it that it's not allowing sources such as nuclear to be able to play a role in there? Because once you do that, there would be mechanisms that allows you to be able to fund those so that in the long term, as you are planning for the immediate and the short term, in the long term, you'll have energy security that will be able to allow you to industrialize and provide for those sectors, for instance, that are energy intensive sectors that we still want to preserve and we know our economy is dependent on. As much as we are looking into the green economy and so on, to expand on that, we should not forget that there are a substantial amount of sectors, such as the mining and the manufacturing, that are energy intensive, that still needs to be catered for. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Number four.
Thank you very much. Jitesh Keshav from Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. I find that the big sections of this report are highly flawed scientifically. I'm actually embarrassed to be actually looking at a report like this coming from the Commission. I question many things. Firstly, you developed a set of criteria. You haven't defined what makes those criteria. These criteria have been developed for over 20 years now. You referenced the United Nations European report, which actually defined all these criteria in great detail. In that report, which you reference on page 60, from looking at over 30 energy sources, nuclear ranks number 3 in terms of normalized life cycle impacts. Nuclear ranks number 3, only to be beaten by hydro, which we don't have the benefit of, and CSP tower, which is obviously very expensive. Yet, when you look at your report, you see a whole lot of red around nuclear. So clearly, you're applying a bias, and let's put weights to these things, and let's stress test your ability to do things properly. Second point, we're talking of variable power, etc. Just ask yourself a simple question, and I ask this question to people who develop these models and say, did you do a real stress test? What happens in a real situation? Right now, Germany is sitting with 25% of its solar capacity generating and 10% of its wind generating. We talk about Germany, we hail it as great. It's got one of the most expensive electricities in the world. Germany's CO2 emissions right now is sitting on 476 grams of carbon dioxide per unit of energy generated. France is sitting at 60% of its nuclear power plants generating with an emission of 56 grams per unit of energy generated. That is almost 8 times less than Germany. And this you can look at it any day of the week and see what the situation is. France has undergone a just transition, and I mentioned this to you guys many times. You say nobody else has done a just transition. France has done a just transition 40 years ago. They took their whole coal sector with labor together and developed a nuclear sector. And the CO2 emissions and the electricity price is one of the cheapest in the world. So when we want to look at examples of just transitions, look at things that have been done successfully. And I'm coming back to the stress test. If you take 2 days of this situation that we have in Germany, we're talking about 3 gigawatts of gas and battery storage. I can assure you, 3 gigawatts of gas is not going to power the balance of 40 megawatts that you need. And the cost of batteries to give you 38 gigawatts of energy that you still need, you can work it out. It will be over 3 trillion rand, and you'll only need it for 2 days. So let us stress test these things, because what we're seeing here today in terms of load shedding is nothing when the grid collapses because you don't have capacity on the grid. And I'm still waiting for that stress test. Can I go on to the next point, please? We talk about the just transition, and I want to make this point. We've looked at the just transition report, etc., and I think it falls highly short of the consultation. We heard it this morning. With labor that is necessary, the word just in just transition is actually coined from the labor movement, and it actually focuses on the benefits that are taken away through the transition, energy transition of labor, not being included in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Number 5 was here, sir.
Vali Pariachi. I'm the strategic advisor of the AMEU, which is the Association of Municipal Electricity Utilities of Southern Africa, and we represent all the metros and Munichs and some affiliates in the power sector. I just want to preface my question with some comments. I think it'll give a bit of clarity. So, as a Munich's collective, we are Eskom's biggest customer. So as a collective, the municipalities, metros are Eskom's biggest customer. To be more specific, the stats that I've got is 47% by sales, 44% by revenue, and 41% by cost. The figures could have slightly changed, but it's thereabouts. And I think we are a bigger customer than the EIUG. Okay? At one time we were together, but I think we've surpassed the EIUG as being that customer. That's the first comment, the first preface comment. Then there's also a notion that seems to be gaining traction that the electricity crisis that we find ourselves in, which could be here for 2 or 3 years, maybe even longer, can be solved by flooding the grid with renewables. So there seems to be that notion. And then, just being technical, it's common knowledge that the grid stability depends on a balanced energy mix, right? Between non-dispatchables and dispatchables technology, okay? And there are many case studies reflecting that, including South Australia, California, etc. So with that as a scene-setter comment, my question, and notwithstanding that the municipalities, as a general comment, support the jet, right? So we support renewables. But the municipalities, together with Eskom, own the grid. So the national grid is owned by the utilities who are responsible and accountable for the stability of the grid. Okay. So with that as a precursor, my question is, what is the role of, let's call it prudent, fit for purpose, dispatchable? The emphasis is on dispatchable technologies vis-a-vis clean coal technologies, hydro, gas, modular, nuclear. During, and especially the electricity crisis situation, right? And given South Africa has an abundant supply of dispatchable technologies. And as I've said, it could last for 2, 3, or maybe longer years, given the global macroeconomic situation. Okay, the Russian-Ukraine war, the EU situation, etc., etc. So what we're saying is that, is there thinking around a balanced jet, a balanced, prudent, fit-for-purpose jet, with a view that we don't compromise the grid? Because I'm emphasizing from another angle, if you flood the grid with renewables without commensurate focus on ancillary services, I like to call it essential reliability services, if you don't do that, we will collapse the grid. So, and we are in the midst of a crisis. That's my question to you, or comment to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we move on to number 6. You need to help me. That was over there. I think you were number 7.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anna Martort, Middelburg Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We were on the front page of Citizen last week because we think that just energy in the electricity crisis is affecting the manufacturing industry tremendously. If we do not have a growing manufacturing industry, we will not have cars, we will not have fridges, we will not have dishwashers. And specifically in the Highveld region of Mpumalanga, many of the manufacturers are actually situated in that area because of the power stations. So for us, it is important that we have reliable, cheap base load for the manufacturers to be able to continue manufacturing. You cannot have, like yesterday, start up an oven at a smelter and then in the middle of it have to switch it off because of the load shedding or load curtailment that they are actually experiencing. So the gentleman there from the DMRE that spoke, I fully agree, he's quite right. We need reliable base load for our industry and our country to grow. So that is the problem that was stated. The solution was that the Middelburg Chamber of Commerce would like to facilitate the establishment of a consortium to be able to take over and go in partnership with Eskom, lease whatever the agreement is within the various organizations to take over Hendrina Power Station. It's got 10 units. Many of them can be changed into various different electricity processes. We need the green energy for the manufacturing of the steel so that we can export our steel. We've got land through the Eskom processes available. Obviously, we will need to be in competition with other people that's going to also submit proposals for that. However, we also have municipal land available in the Middelburg area where we can then set up whatever is necessary. We have got an advantage that none of the other areas do, except maybe the Emalahleni area. We've got 3 power stations in our region. So our access to the grid and access to the customer is immediate. So anybody interested in participating and talking to us, you're welcome to contact me.
Thank you. Steve, it was you and then you, sir.
Yeah, maybe just to respond to some of the questions around the various studies. I think that DMRE misheard. We did look at local studies as well. But just to get back to the international studies, I mean, these studies are being done by the IEA, the very institutions that you quote. They're being done by Harvard and Oxford. These are reputable, well-researched organizations who are thinking about things like grid balancing and ancillary services. Where we have looked at comparable grids, we've looked at grids that are similar to ours in terms of scope and extent, but also isolation. So one of the big challenges of comparing to a European grid, for example, is they're plugged into a much bigger grid that has access to French nuclear energy, although that energy is not as reliable as people maintain. But to get back to the local studies, we've looked at a number of local studies, predominantly done by the University of Cape Town, by the CSIR, and by the business sector through the National Business Initiative and BUSA. And all of them say more or less the same things. All of them consider the questions that you're raising around stress testing, around looking at, many of them looked at hourly data, looking at what would happen if you had 2 weeks, for example, of no unexpected wind and sun, and all of them maintain a reliable service delivery. They also all look at things like ancillary services, grid management, frequency management, inertia in the system, and there are a lot of modern technological solutions that would help that transition and provide dispatchable power, and also reduce the need for some large cases of dispatchable power. And so what we are witnessing is a change in the way we think about energy systems. And it's to the point about the recommendations for renewable energy, batteries and gas peaking. Of course, that's not all that's in the system. We're not saying that you should shut down the existing system and replace it with this system. We're in transition. And so the coal-fired power plants that exist and that are scheduled not to be shut down by that point will still be in the system. And so you have an interaction between the old and the new that will provide stable electricity to industry and to households. That will change over time as you phase out those coal-fired power plants purely from sort of financial reasons, and therefore you need this renewable base to take it up. But those kinds of high penetration, 80% penetration challenges are not happening in the next couple of IRP cycles as we plan, you know. We are very happy to share our data, the detail of the studies. We'd love to see the studies that the DMRE reference that state these systems are not compatible. All of the models look at a wide range of dispatchable technologies, including nuclear, including both large-scale and small-scale nuclear. And the reality is the models are not picking them because they're not least cost options. And so maybe we can review assumptions and that might change what the model puts out, but these assumptions have been tested with countless engagements with experts, both locally and internationally. I do want to just mention that we applaud some of the changes that the DMRE have made to the IOP process. We think looking at the long term out to 2050 is fantastic, and also that they're including looking at the grid and grid stability, also fantastic. And I think these are all the right questions, and I think together we can come up with some solid answers. The point that was made about the energy plan, integrated energy plan, IEP, I think is a very good one. And just for the Commissioner's planning is because of the IRP review and the urgency of the electricity crisis, they have been focusing on electricity in the short term, but that the IEP is the key thing, and that's what they will move their attention to in the next part of the year, second part of the year, beginning of the following year. So agreed, IEP is central and is in demand for steel and other industrial processes, the electrification of vehicles, the production of hydrogen. And so it's very difficult, at least in the long term, to be thinking about electricity independent of the rest of the economy and of the broader energy sector. And so that's where attention will turn in the next phase. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Sir? Noted your hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Taljaard, Technical Specialist at the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association. One comment from our side is that the planning recommendation is for a policy-adjusted IRP, and the numbers 50 to 60 gigawatts of VRE is noted. What we are just wanting to comment on is if there's any thought being put into the private sector investment in large-scale utility or large-scale renewable energy, and also municipal public procurement. As many in this room know, that the IRP is inherently a national public procurement roadmap or planning document. And I just want to understand from the PCC's point of view is what impact or what role do they see the private sector investment in generation capacity playing? As we've seen just in the month of March, more than 1 gigawatt of new wind capacity was registered with NERSA, and there's a few different reasons for that, one being the ERA Schedule 2 licensing registration cap being lifted. And also I think that that points to the fact that there is a lot of funding available for utility scale renewable energy. And I think at the end of the day, that is also something that you need to take into account. If you don't have funding available for a project, it doesn't really matter how keen you are to build that project. If you don't have funding available, that is inherently a constraint. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You're welcome.
Thank you, Chair. This again, Naidu. want to ask two questions that are a little bit unrelated. And preamble the first one. And the first one's about nuclear. I think it's valid to put nuclear in the mix. It has always been in the mix. But South Africa's own ambition in this regard has been very limitedly expressed. So in the IRP 2019, and even in the announcements that the Minister of Energy made last year, the ambition seems to be capped at 2 SMRs, small modular reactors. One would think, with what was being expressed here, that a much bigger ambition would in fact be expressed. And maybe we're missing it. Maybe the DMRE should have a chance to expand. The second point I want to make associated with that is some of the big new moves around SMRs in the world. And the obvious example now is China and Shandong. I mean, they're putting 6 modular units around 600 megawatt capacity as a shoring mechanism in the diversity of the mix against what they're planning to do on renewable energy, primarily solar and wind onshore and offshore, of 1,000 gigawatts. So this is the scale at which one is operating. So I think there's an element of practicality that needs to enter the discussion. But as I say, maybe we should leave it out there as a question for the DMRE to respond to, or anybody else. The second question relates to the third point that Brian made. And I want to relate that back to the discussion that happened this morning in that really excellent panel. That one of the ambitions that South Africa has to have is around this localization and the ambition of an industrial platform around energy in the country. That industrial platform, looking at other places in the world that do it, relies not only on a local market, and the South African local market is small. It means it has to be a global market. And the relation to what Brian put out in his presentation is the issue of the integration into the continent. And that integration is something that isn't finding enough expression in any of the energy discussions that we're having. And maybe it's a really important one. I mean, for a long while, the Southern African Power Pool, although it was a foreign policy instrument for very specific reasons, was a big part of a reasonable energy security in the Southern African region. The ambitions that are being spoken about now with the large new infrastructure investments right throughout the continent is talking about the possibility of an integration right throughout the continent around organizing not only for that energy security, but for the local need and the size of market that would make sense for substantive investments in the industrialization. So maybe folk want to comment on that as well. Thank you, Jacques.
Sure. So I'm going to take your hand and then I'm going to ask some comments again.
Yes. Just with regards to these online platform contributions, is that also considered within this conversation?
Sure, I couldn't hear.
Oh, sorry. There's people online who would like to engage. Are they able to engage here, or should they lobby us to be able to speak on their behalf?
So unfortunately, because the breakout facilities don't allow individuals in different breakout groups, they're not able to respond, but we do encourage them to provide their input to mitigation@climatecommission.org.za. We really want to hear your voices, and apologies that you're not able to participate in this session. We would have loved that.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Name is Fanele Mondi from EIUG. One is just maybe just to make an appeal, Chair. I think in the last round we had about 6 questions and quite long questions for that matter, but the answer was very short. My sense is that probably making too many questions and long questions deprive us of a meaningful discussion. So I would suggest that maybe we just keep the numbers short, and the questions short so that we can have proper discussion. The second point, Chair, is about the point which has been raised on stress testing. I hear the comments from Steve around, the work which has been done in terms of that stress testing. And I think this point is coming not only today, it came in other consultations as well. Because stress testing is not just about the technical aspects only, it's all other factors, the ecosystem. For instance, one of the questions is to say, does the policy environment allow us to do some of these things? I don't get the sense that that was done in terms of what could be the barriers. Also, other than to say there is a policy change that is required, to say what changes in policy that are required. So in my view, those are some of the things we just have to make sure that they are covered as part of this stress testing. And then the point which was made by Thabang earlier on, I think as EIUG is a point which we're quite concerned about, in terms of the system operations. To say right now we have about, I think, 6,000 megawatts of renewable energy on a base which is primarily base load and dispatchable. The impact is very small. But once you start shifting that, what could be the implications? I think ESCOM, as we speak right now, I don't think they've got a feel of that. I think the point Thabang was making to say probably not because people are pushing back, but is to say when we get to this point, this plan, it must be stress tested in such a way that we will know when we get to 10%, it will still be safe. When we get to 30%, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to take the local conditions into account because to use only the literature whose energy mix is different to ours as well as our interconnectedness may not necessarily be the right thing to do, Chair. So I just wanted to make those comments. But the last one, Chair, my concern is that as part of this development, I think Commissioner Montlana touched on it earlier on, the issues of transparency and inclusiveness. It worries me that the policymakers who are effectively the people who will be implementing these recommendations, they don't seem to have been consulted up front. That's what I read. Probably other people, that's what they read in the room. It may well be that it's a misunderstanding, but that's what I sense right now, because in my view, for these recommendations to be implementable, I think if they had been consulted, probably wouldn't be having these questions which they're asking right now. Probably the same might apply with the system operator who eventually will inherit whatever comes out of this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Carrington Tlale from Black Business Council, Infrastructure Portfolio Committee. It's a bit concerning. We've went through the recommendations and we have also been in quite a number of consultative meetings as well. And there's always a problem that renewables don't want to accommodate anyone. And yet other energy mixes are accommodative to renewables. And I think the recommendations should actually take into consideration that it is not a renewable introduction. It is a just transition to a net. And I think that is some of the challenges that we're having, is that it is net zero. It is not complete zero emissions. And I think that is some messaging that needs to be put through by the Commission in that it feels like it is only advocating for renewables when the move for transition should be, what is the current challenges that we're having currently as a country? Let's put those quick gains into place that would also continue to contribute to low carbon. If you look at the transition from coal to clean coal technology, that is a reduction in emissions. But those are being, we don't know if it's purposefully being rejected, neglected, but we need that to be taken into consideration. We do understand that the mandate would be to focus on renewables, but I think that is something that needs to be put out much clearly. My second point is that we have been in so many meetings with technical experts from ESCOM, people that are working with these, with all the challenges that they have. And it seems like our own expertise is being neglected. And that is also concerning. If we are benchmarking against somebody that is overseas, when we have a utility, no matter how you have got challenges now, that has got experts, that has got knowledge, that are offering advice, and that is being neglected, that is really concerning. You're going to have an international utility that no one in the country is willing to support. And I think my last point is the least cost option. Is it the least cost financially, or is it the least cost to this country? You would have renewables, but the cost to this country will be immeasurable. Thank you.
Sir, thank you for those inputs. Steve, would you mind to just maybe make a few comments on some of the discussions that are currently on the table before you jump in? So you've touched on something that that's close to our heart as well, and I'm talking from a Labour perspective, is that unless there's total transparency, you're not going to get buy-in. So it's absolutely important for that transparency to filter through this whole process, make us part of the solutions as community, as Labour, as business, in making sure that this country works. Just to maybe touch on another comment that you've made, there are certainly some quick gains that are available. And I think what we need to do is utilize those resources where we've currently got them, spatially, and utilize them. And I think that would also address some of the concerns you've got in terms of the least cost. But the least cost is not just least cost. I'm going to ask Steve just to talk about the least cost, because there's been quite a intense discussion about the least cost, because there are a number of factors that feed into that to come to a notion of least cost. But what is the least cost? Steve?
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, maybe on this point of transparency, the PCC has tried to be completely transparent in these processes. Our engagements with stakeholder groups are available online. You're able to watch many of them. We had 2 stakeholder engagement sessions with each of the social partners, as well as several engagement sessions with communities to try to understand perspectives. And we have recorded those perspectives, hopefully quite faithfully, in the stakeholder perspectives report that was released with the technical report as the pre-reading. We're also very happy to make available all of the assumptions and even the models that have been used in the study, although I'm taking credit for other people's work here. The people who did the work are very happy to make available their assumptions and their models, so we're able to see the degree of stress testing. So we're very happy to engage in that kind of transparent debate around these key issues. And the stress testing is critical. Like, we're not saying that it's not. Stress testing is critical, and I think the point that was made, you need to do the stress testing at considering local factors at different penetrations of renewable energy. Completely agree with that. But just to re-emphasize the point that we have been looking at local studies, and those local studies have been doing that stress testing and have found the renewable energy systems, as we transition, remembering that there's still coal in the system, are stable and reliable. I also wanted to make a point. Someone raised a question earlier about emergency responses. The government is moving quickly on emergency responses. So there's the work that NECOM's doing, there's the work that Operation Vulindlela are doing, there's the budget announcements and the budget speech which promote support for rooftop solar, to that very earlier question. And so a lot of those efforts are underway. The question about clean coal, so clean coal is in the suite of options that these models are able to select, but again, they don't come out in least cost, and the typical clean coal technology that people talk about is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. these are, and I guess the same would be true for modular reactors, these are nascent technologies. They're not commercially viable technologies at this point, and so they're not things that we can start to include in the energy mix now. But we do talk about in our report that modeling is something that needs to be redone, things change, things become cheaper, and so we talk about kind of technologies to watch, and CCS and small modular reactors are on those lists of technologies. If they did become cheaper and competitive with renewables, then of course that's something that we would talk about. The role of carbon capture, utilization, storage is unlikely to be a big differentiator in the power sector. So you have coal technologies already not competitive from a financial cost perspective with renewables, and any additional CCUS has two impacts. It makes that coal plant more expensive to run, but also it makes the coal plant less efficient because you have to use some of the power that the coal plant produces to sequester the carbon. So we think that CCS is a very useful technology when we're starting to think about high density, high value carbon streams that come out of industrial processes like would be run by Sasol, the cement and steel industries, but unlikely to make a material difference in the coal sector. Although, of course, any kind of efficiency measure is very important in the transition, so any technology that we can use to reduce the emissions of existing coal is critical. The cost question is a great one. So we have anchored our models on least cost financially, right? What is the cheapest LCOE for a suite of technologies that are providing all of the system services that are required? So frequency management, power generation, all of these things. And that proves to be a system in transition where you focus investment on renewables, battery storage, and also pumped hydro, and then gas for peaking. And the gas for peaking is important. It also plays an interseasonal power balancing role. So for these long-term 3-4 day periods where you might not have the renewable energy that you had hoped. But if we start to look at the actual cost to society, so not only are they the cheapest to build and therefore put the lowest pressure on national balance sheets, so they're much more realistically financeable. There isn't the same kind of financial premium that you would have if you try to fund or insure coal, for example. It's almost impossible to insure a new coal-fired plant at the moment, which puts capital costs up significantly. So if you weigh up the challenges, the key question is variable renewable energy systems are secure. We think they are. We're very happy to engage on that. Then that system is cheapest. You do have to pay very careful attention to the communities that are impacted by transitions out of coal, and that obviously carries a cost. But the other benefits that come with that is better access to international markets. So we would have lower emissions goods that are more competitive on international markets. Some of the speakers and the panel at the beginning certainly raised that. You have better access to cheaper capital. You have lower impact on lives lost through air quality, and just the cost of that is a significant cost that needs to be factored in. And then, of course, there are the externalities embedded in climate change. And so runaway climate change would cause significant costs to the economy and critically impact the poor the most. Those that are wealthy have the ability to respond. They have air conditioning, they have flood protection, they have insurance, whereas poor communities don't have that. So it is our assessment that the total cost to society is far better in a variable renewable energy direction transition and not in the extending coal direction. And in fact, one of the recommendations we make in the report is that we should investigate stricter carbon budgets because that drives more economic growth, better investment, and better competitiveness, but critically provides better outcomes from a health, employment, and sort of social perspective for poor and isolated communities.
Thank you, Steve. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been shown the hand from our timekeeper. Lunch is close by. maybe one or two final comments. Okay. All right. Shall we go by the fastest hand first? But maybe let's do this. I saw 4 hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. And ladies and gentlemen, that's then the final hands with final input or comments with regards to this working session. Thank you. Sir.
Yes, and thanks. You know, just to put things into context, I was looking at Eskom's capacity as we speak today, 47,000 megawatts. And so that's the entire fleet that Eskom has. Granted, only half of that is operational, and that's why we have load shedding. We are now proposing 5 gigawatts above the Eskom capacity to be constructed by 2030. Just to give you context, we have not stress tested this proposal, technically, financially, and we are now putting it forward as an option into the IRP. I think we need to take a few steps back. We need to do proper technical assessment on the proposals. Thanks.
Thank you. Short and sweet. Louise?
So I think 2 things. The one is that, you know, I think we need a learning culture amongst all of us. And I think many people have referred to whether we should learn from overseas or we shouldn't learn. So we must learn from them because they've done just transitions before us, but we mustn't learn from them on their energy supply mix because it's not, you know, I think our learning culture has to be able to learn from anywhere and then apply it and rework it for our own context. And I think we're perfectly competent to do, you know, amongst all of us sitting here and other experts who are not in this room, to do that kind of domestication. So I think we should be open to learning from anywhere, but just domesticate it to our own context. And what I'm actually hearing out of the inputs that have come here is an opportunity to have a dedicated session between some of the experts in the PCC, the Secretariat, and among the commissioners who are energy experts, or the organizations who are energy experts, and the South African experts who did the studies that we drew on, so that that can be also a knowledge sharing session. And I think such a dedicated session would be a really useful output of this meeting. I do just want to flag that in terms of, you know, some of us are being heavily lobbied by those online. So I just want to flag that there is not necessarily an agreement around the role of nuclear and the role of gas. And that is the hard task of the Commission, in that we are tasked. It's our mandate that we have to come to some consensus, you know, having done the proper technical work of what we're going to recommend. So, you know, that means that not every word every stakeholder says ends up being in our recommendations, because it's our job to weigh these things. And then I just want to close, Jacques, thank you for indulging me, just to sharpen our minds that there is, the science tells us that there is a global carbon budget. If we want 66% chance, and personally I'm not a gambler who would take such low odds, but okay, for 66% chance of stabilizing at 1.5 degrees, we have got 420 gigatons of carbon emissions that we can emit between now and forever. And if we continue at the same levels of emissions, this is globally, you know, we adjust for our own country and the fact that we are a developing country, but globally, if we continue at the levels of 2019's emissions, we would use up that global carbon budget by 2030, if not before. So, you know, there's a very scientific foundation for the need for urgent and deep action around this. And South Africa actually has a wonderful opportunity because our electricity sector is so carbon intensive. And it's an easy one-stop shop to solve the problem. you know, with mature technologies that exist. So I think we can almost say, you know, aren't we fortunate that it's so easy for us to decarbonize our economy? Thank you.
On that positive note, thank you. Sir.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Basanda Nondlazi, postdoc CSIR. Just want to appreciate, come from environmental science, remote sensing background. Just want to appreciate the technicality of the discussion, and this is particularly why I took this postdoc, so that I can learn a lot. And I'm also learning that a lot of talk around just transition, you know, is looking at just transition from a different a discussion perspective than what a person walking down the street would have. A person walking down the street thinks about justice for themselves, while discussions in this room might be thinking about discussion for the country. And so, you know, the question on whose justice is it anyway becomes important, because the justice for a person walking down the street, or justice for a community in Mabopane when it comes to energy, might be a different discussion than what we're having in the room. So that is quite interesting for me to note. But my parting shot is this one. I think Minister Barbara Creasy mentioned a very important point. I think, you know, when it comes to the level of the municipality, the great question that the municipality has is, how will this transition affect our revenue? Because the municipality knows that we make revenue by selling electricity. And so if you take away those sales, what will we use to live and pay our staff? And I think that doesn't come out strongly in the discussion. And that is, again, a discussion about just transition that a person in the municipality would want to have, that maybe does not come out in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sir, 2 minutes.
I'll be quick, Chair, because I don't want to get into everybody's lunchtime. Look, I think the reality that we have here in South Africa is that nuclear is expensive, hydro is out of reach, wind is expensive, right? So we have to look at the reality and deal with things that we can do. We are all aware that we have to have reduced emissions by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. So these are things we should consider very seriously, and I'm sorry, I seem biased, but at this point, storage, solar, and to second the gentleman's point, these are seemingly the only options we do have that is within both sort of government's realm and the private sector to do something and respond. It's not like we're saying that we don't want to hear other sides of the story like gas and LNG and other things. But currently, we can't afford all of those things. So the only thing we can realistically afford is solar, and we have plenty of it. We have more solar than Europe combined. We have more solar than the United States. We are doing better in solar than literally more than the world. I think the only countries that beat us in solar are it's the Middle East maybe, and also South America. So I think we should give it a serious consideration, because our solar would put Germany to shame.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, 2.5 times the global average is the solar that we've got.
And it's free.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it sits in the wrong part of the country. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, allow me to firstly thank Brian for his inputs. Belinda, thank you for taking notes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation and your inputs. Steve, obviously well appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, lunch will be served. I'm thinking in the foyer in the front, and let's all reconvene here at 2:30 promptly.
Lunch is outside.
Was it outside?
If you sort of go past the Tanzanite room, you should find it.
Okay, just follow your nose.
Yeah. Hopefully, positive smells.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Jean. Well facilitated.